Hello everyone. Tonight I would like to explore with you the history of a world that is often ignored, sometimes misunderstood, and that has become almost invisible nowadays, even though it is still here. The world of monasteries, and more broadly of monasticism, especially Catholic monasticism. How all this appeared, why, and also the importance of monasteries along history, especially at their peak in the Middle Ages, a time when monasteries were important in the economic and social life of Christendom. And as an example, we will take a quick look at a particularly important medieval abbey, the Abbey of Cluny in France. In a modern society, individuals demand liberties. We are called to become whatever we want to be. There's an emphasis put on entertainment and the satisfaction of short-term needs. In general, individualism dominates. I mean, not individualism in the sense of selfishness, but in a broader sense, an understanding of society that places individuals and their free will as the relevant source of power, instead of traditional structures such as families, communities, or a higher divine authority. For a large part, the social history of the past 2 centuries in Western countries is one of empowerment of the individual, for better or worse. And so the choice to drop everything, to become a monk or a nun, material possessions, the possibility to take decisions, the freedom of movement, of traveling, also the differentiation with others, as differences will disappear behind the same habit, to join a community, or live alone sometimes. This sounds really at odds with how modernity is often defined. This is rather contrarian, not really what society invites us to do. And yet, now, like since the first centuries of Christianity, some people take this decision to withdraw from society, to devote themselves entirely to a life of prayer, of work, with varying degrees of solitude. We will see that there are really different approaches, different traditions in Christian monasticism, and a life of self-denial to an extent. Now, it doesn't mean nuns and monks are completely separated from their time. First, because they need to work anyway. They need to see doctors, to eat a variety of foods. They sometimes see their families and friends from outside. They live withdrawn, but not in autarky. Also because they are people from their time too. A few months ago, I fell into this rabbit hole of discovering what monasticism was like, where it came from, and why people chose it. And one thing that strikes me, watching recent documentaries, listening to testimonies of nuns and monks, especially the younger ones, is that they very often speak of choosing happiness, of choosing the life that suited them, what deep down they aspired to find. This kind of discourse is typical of the empowered individual I mentioned just before. The individual looking for personal accomplishment meaning and happiness in this life. Of course, there is way more to it for people who follow that path. They do it out of faith. For others too, as they believe this life of prayer and self-denial will not just allow their salvation, but others too. But still, this explanation, which I believe to be very honest, is typical of our times. 2 or 3 centuries ago, the justification for such a life choice would have revolved more around duty, sacrifice, and maybe happiness, yes, but not in this life. Because back then this was not the kind of life goal that would have been considered legitimate, or at least admittable. So we have a lot to explore, but as usual we are going to take things in order, and I will explain them simply. So all you have to do is relax. Bear in mind that if you wish to listen to my stories in other languages, you can. There are Lights Out Library in American English and La Bibliothèque de los Sueños in Spanish, both narrated by Olympia. And there is now La Bibliothèque des Rêves in French, that I record myself. You will find links to these podcasts and channels in the description box and the first comment. I also invite you to join my Patreon page if you wish to get more of this channel and support it. And now, let's begin. Monasticism, which is a phenomenon that can take different forms, appeared probably before Christianity. There is also a very ancient tradition of monasticism in Buddhism, for example, and this appeared in ancient India. In Greek and Roman antiquity, there were individuals and small groups who lived ascetic or contemplative lives. But this is not really considered monasticism, because they lacked the structured communities and the rules of conduct that define monks. By the way, this word, monk, moine in French, monje in Spanish, Mönch in German, it comes from Greek monakos, meaning single or solitary. The root of the word is monos, meaning alone. And this still reflects the very origins of Christian monasticism. In the second half of the 3rd century AD, some people, some Christians, started to adopt a life of withdrawal from society. They would renounce all worldly possessions and family life, and instead decide to dedicate all their time to praying, studying scriptures, laboring too, as they needed to live from something, and performing cleansing exercises such as fasting. This phenomenon seems to have first appeared in Egypt, and people who adopted this lifestyle are called Anchorites. An Anchorite, or Anchoress for women, often stayed in the same place and took a vow of stability. They would promise themselves and others to stay permanently enclosed, often in a cell attached to a church, and they would answer to high church authorities, to the bishops. That's the difference between an anchorite and a hermit. The difference can be tenuous, and anchorites are a type of hermits. The definition of a hermit is broader it is someone who chooses to live in seclusion. But these Egyptian Anchorites and their successors across Christendom also followed a number of rules. They made vows, they obeyed this Christian hierarchy, and this is why they are not just called hermits, even though it would be correct to call them so. At the time, the 3rd century AD, in Egypt and more generally in the Levant, Christianity had spread, and it was already several generations old. It had grown steadily since the 1st century, but it was no massive phenomenon yet. It is obviously very difficult to establish statistics about antiquity, and even more regarding the number of Christians, because they had to hide. Their practice was rejected, not directly out of religious intolerance. The Romans tolerated foreign cults, but mostly because the Christians were troublesome for Roman society and traditions, to an extent like the Jews were too. They were troublesome because they refused to show devotion or even respect to Roman gods. They actively and explicitly called them idols that were false, unworthy of worship. And that hit right at the social importance, the function of Roman religion. The Romans were never interested in imposing their gods to everyone, but they demanded respect to their gods and their rites, because participating in this was a way of showing allegiance to Rome, to its state, to its values, and to its dominion. So, refusing to engage with Roman religion was very passive-aggressive in the Romans' view, and attacking the Roman gods was worse than that. It was sedition. That's the basis for the rejection of Christians across the Roman Empire and their persecution. Of course, other factors also played a role and added to it. They were a minority, a small one, as we are going to see, and not a powerful minority, as Christianity attracted rather poor people, even slaves. So they didn't weigh much initially, politically or economically, and that made the Christians perfect scapegoats, even better than the Jews at the time. The Jews were somewhere around 5 to 10% of the population across the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. It is estimated there were 3 to 6 million of them out of 50 to 60 million people in the Roman Empire. Also in the 3rd century, the Christians were 1 to 5%. As I said, the number is very hard to establish because the Christians often hid their beliefs and met secretly. But experts estimate there were about 1 to 2 million Christians at the time. Later, this number would grow dramatically. But as you see, in its first 250 years, Christianity had not been spreading like a wildfire. It was more of a slow, almost underground movement, that for many Romans was almost invisible at this stage. And so, returning to our Anchorites, there were a small population of, let's say, eccentric people, themselves part of a religious group made of outcasts, or that was frowned upon in Roman society at large. But still, This lifestyle had a limited success in Christian circles, and the practice of Anchoritism went on for centuries as one of the earliest forms of Christian monasticism. It spread to medieval Europe, where it reached its peak by the late Middle Ages, 1,000 years after its beginnings. Numbers were always small. For example, the highest number ever recorded in England for the number of Anchorites was around 200, and it was in the 13th century and for all of England. So we are not speaking of a big phenomenon here. And it seems that in Western Europe, in the Middle Ages, this attracted more women. There would have been several more times Anchoresses than Anchorites. In the Middle Ages, Anchorites generally lived in cells built against one of the walls of their local church in villages. And the life of uncompromising enclosure that some chose sounds really tough. Some of them, not all, because others could freely move between their cells and the church, but some chose to stay inside their cells forever, for the remainder of their lives, only praying, attending masses taking place in the church through a small window in the wall of their cell, whereas a second window in their cell gave them some daylight, and a third window would exist to pass them food and take back the dishes. And that was all. They stayed in there until they died, without any human contact of any kind, beyond what they heard from the outside or the people bringing them food. This practice declined and finally disappeared a few centuries ago. By the 16th, 17th centuries, depending on the places, it was over. As I told you, though, it was never a big phenomenon. In part because another, much more successful approach to monastic life had risen. Cenobitism, which is the real basis for monastic orders to appear, and what we generally think of when it comes to monks and nuns. Cenobitism is communities living together, sharing rules and a common purpose. The Cenobitic lifestyle, which appeared in the 4th century, not that long after Anchorites, consisted and still consists of a group of men or women gathering to live in a community under the authority of one of them, a superior. This is what a cenobite is, a member of a religious group living with other like-minded people in a monastic community. People who take vows of staying in their community, of obeying the community and its leader, and of devoting themselves entirely to this life, which implies renunciation to family life, procreation. There's always a vow of celibacy and chastity coming with it. And this Cenobitic monasticism, which is also believed to have started in Egypt, was probably for a part a reaction to the very demanding and isolating life of Anchorites. Also maybe a reaction to the concept of living alone, isolated too. The message of the Gospel and the ulterior interpretations of Christian theologists speaks a lot of experiencing the love of God, of experiencing the wonders of creation through others. It is by serving, by giving, by doing things with and for others that one experiences the presence of God and spreads his message. Someone who lives completely alone can think of others, pray for others, but there is always the risk that this love will remain theoretical or purely rhetorical, without the depth and incarnation that make it real, if it is not experienced with, through people. And that's a point all monastic communities care about. They live in communities because it is convenient for material life. It gives them the means to pray more, study more. But this communal life is also a way of serving and learning to love others. From orders that see themselves as communities of hermits, that spend a lot of time separated, to orders in which community life is emphasized and almost constant, with members doing most things side by side. This brotherhood or sisterhood dimension is very important across all cenobitic monastic orders. So I was saying that for a part, it was a reaction or an alternative to eremitic life. Cenobitic monks socialized way more between them, and also often with villages living near the places where they created their monasteries. And so in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, this form of monastic life developed, essentially in the east of the Roman Empire, in Egypt, in the Levant, Anatolia or Greece. It would take longer for monasticism to develop in the West. An initial barrier to it was that nothing in the scriptures, the commandments, or the early precepts of Christianity, nothing calls for this particular lifestyle. Actually, religions around the world have differing views of monasticism. I told you it also existed under a different form in Buddhism. In Judaism, there was never anything similar. There were communities based on intense religious practice that could superficially look like monasticism. And there are still some Orthodox Jewish groups that live in enclaves, rather closed from the rest of the world, and with a strict observance of religious principles, with an emphasis on studying the scriptures and obeying religious law. But these communities are not formed by monks. They prioritize family, and the children are part of them. That's not monasticism. Now, maybe with the exception of fringe groups, there is no monasticism, and even a critique of it, in the Islamic and Protestant traditions, for different reasons. In Islam, monasticism was critiqued very early. When Muslims encountered Christian monasteries, on the basis that monastic life was an excess, Islamic theology encouraged active participation in society, including marriage, work, and community responsibilities. On that basis, choosing to withdraw from society and stay celibate, renounce to procreation, and to other acts that are pro-social, that would be a wrong life path. It would also be too extreme, as believers are invited to find balance in life. A middle path between materialism and asceticism, not too much, but not too few neither. Choosing to deprive oneself of property, like choosing seclusion, is therefore seen as disrupting this balance. It would be more an abandonment of duties than a fruitful sacrifice. Now this critique has historical roots too. When the Islamic expansion began, it started through regions that were predominantly Christian. These people needed to be converted, and Islam adopted a critical view of Christian practices. It is logical. Across many denominations of Protestantism, there is also a historically critical view of monasticism. From the very start, on different grounds. First, the absence of biblical basis to it. The Reformation emphasized the need to return to the scriptures and get rid or re-examine centuries and centuries of interpretation and rules that the Church had added to them. From the celibacy of priests to the existence of a purgatory to even the hierarchy of the Catholic Church itself, none of this was in the Old or the New Testament. Neither was monasticism, which was one way of living a life of faith that was invented after Christianity had appeared, and without any reference to it in the Bible. So Protestantism, which can also not be separated from its history, it was a reaction to what was seen as the errors and excesses of Catholicism. So Protestantism, at least numerous denominations of it, traditionally rejects monasticism for its lack of biblical base. Celibacy, poverty, and obedience to a religious superior in a community are seen as unbiblical burdens that no one should opt for. Another critique comes from the Protestant view that all Christians are equal before God, something that the fathers of the Reformation, Luther or Calvin, emphasized a lot. There shouldn't be a special spiritual status for priests or monks or nuns, as everyone is equally able to understand and appropriate God's word. So the critique here is that monasticism, like the vertical hierarchy in Roman Catholicism, created an elite class, which implied that other Christians were less able to connect with God directly, were less holy. And there was also a critique of celibacy. Luther, who was a former monk, strongly opposed mandatory celibacy on the grounds that it would contradict human nature and biblical teachings. And last but not least, early Protestants also had a critique similar to the Islamic one. Monasticism would be escapist, a way of rejecting engagement with the world, which would be where faith should be lived. Now the Catholic tradition has counter-arguments to all this, from the individual freedom of choice that makes any form of living one's faith worthy of respect, to the belief that prayer alone, intercession, can change the world for the better. But this controversy is not our topic tonight. These were the reasons why there is no equivalent to monastic orders in Islam and many Protestant denominations. This rejection is not systematic across all Protestant denominations, though. Some have retained monasticism, especially the Anglicans. In any case, at the time when Christian monasticism appeared in Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries, Islam and Protestantism were not things yet. And with its development in medieval times, monasticism was going to become something else, a phenomenon that was not just about individuals choosing a lifestyle, but also about institutions, monasteries, that were going to be inserted into medieval societies, economically, socially, and also intellectually. Because for centuries, monasteries would also become centers of knowledge. How did that happen? First, with the Church embracing monasticism, which was not a given. I told you the Anchorites often lived attached to a church and obeyed the bishops, but they were not chosen by the Church, just accepted, tolerated sometimes. And the first monasteries that appeared in Egypt and later in the Levant were not founded by the Church directly. There were initiatives from outside of it. The endorsement of the Church for monasteries, the encouragement of this lifestyle as a path to a good life for the faithful, this did a lot to help recruitment and the founding of new monasteries. For the Church, one of the appeals of monasticism in Western Europe, when it started to really appear there from the 6th century, was how helpful it could be for the Christianization of populations. A monastery somewhere was like a beacon, an example that helps convert people at a time when the Christianization of Europe was far from done. Here again, it is interesting to take a look at figures. By the 7th century, Christianity was dominant in areas of Western Europe that had been Romanized for a long time. In Italy, Gaul, Spain, especially in cities, where 80 to 90% of people were Christians. But in rural regions, that percentage fell to between a third and a half only. The domination of Christianity was far from assured. Putting a monastery near a village with monks that would set a positive example to the villagers helped the zone become more prosperous. That was a good way of converting people. And even more beyond these Romanized regions, where the percentage of Christians quickly dropped. In Anglo-Saxon England, for example, it is estimated that 20 to 30% of the population might have been nominally Christian by the year 700, and they were concentrated in certain areas like Kent, that had received intense missions. By the late 7th century, 50% or so of the European population would have been Christian. By the late 8th century, 100 years later, 70 to 80%. And by the 9th century, 85 to 90%. This Christianization was made possible sometimes by force. I told you about Charlemagne and the Saxons in a recent episode. But more often than not, it was obtained by sending missionaries that were often monks. A tradition developed in Western Europe that became particularly strong in Ireland, but also existed in Great Britain, northern France or Germany, for monks to leave their place of birth and go into the pagan world to establish monastic communities and convert the pagans. The Irish monks were particularly zealous and are credited for converting other lands such as Scotland, part of Germany or Switzerland. Numerous missions to pagan territory that sometimes cost them their lives were organized by English and French monks to Poland, Hungary or Scandinavia, that at the time were all predominantly pagan regions. Now, a concern for the Church at the time was that all these monasteries followed the rules decided by their abbot or abbess. And inevitably, the lack of control could lead to cultish practices, communities that could drift away from the Church's precepts. Or a more serious problem was the existence of extreme practices. In some of these communities, monks or nuns would engage into self-harm as penance, be it by extreme fasting, mortification, or self-inflicted injuries. These excesses were not the norm, but they existed, and on a big enough scale to become a concern. For a part, they were responsible for the initiative of a man, a monk, Saint Benedict of Nursia, to write and distribute a rule, a guidebook, spiritually but also very concretely, materially, for people who wanted to organize a monastery. Saint Benedict lived in the 6th century, and his rule was immensely successful. It was adopted by a majority of European monasteries along the Middle Ages. When you hear of Benedictine monks or nuns, this means they follow Saint Benedict's rule. What made it successful was its flexibility. Instead of fixing rules that would have to be respected, whatever the circumstances, it calls very realistically for common sense and adaptation. What really is at the center of the rule is the aspiration to a life of simplicity, poverty, work, and prayer. Ora et labora, pray and work. This is a motto of the Benedictines that summarizes this path. A life balanced between spiritual devotion and work, which includes manual labor as well as study or other productive tasks. And all the other rules serve these purposes. They are recommendations that every abbot can adapt to their community. Saint Benedict is considered the father of Western monasticism, and it is true that his rule, written almost 1500 years ago, has resisted the passing of time very well. it is still the most used across the monastic world by members of the Benedictine order, the Benedictines, men and women. Now the monastic world is historically rather decentralized. Monasteries remain typically autonomous. Sometimes they keep a particular bond with another monastery that founded them. That is to say, a group of monks or nuns left their monastery of origin to create another one. Often because the original one had outgrown its capacity, a bit like bees leaving a hive to create a new one. This is how, especially in medieval times, some abbeys turned into a multinational organization, with their daughter abbeys starting to found new communities themselves. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But what is the difference, by the way, between these terms, monastery, abbey, or convent? Monastery is the broadest term because it is not specific to Christianity. It is a term for any community of monks or for the buildings where they live. A convent is also a monastery. And here again, it also names the community and the place where the community lives. But in modern usage, it tends to be restricted to communities of women, and there is an equivalent, friary, for men, for friars, even though it is little used. Now, abbey is another term that refers to particular monasteries. All abbeys are monasteries, but not all monasteries are abbeys. The term abbey is restricted to monasteries or convents headed by an abbot or an abbess, people that have a higher status and recognition in the Catholic Church. So the existence of an abbey implies a particular recognition from the Church. And abbess or abbot is like a title, even though they are not typically appointed, like a bishop or a cardinal. They are usually elected by the members of their community. It was not always like that historically, but nowadays it is. When they are not abbots, the leaders of monasteries can be called prior or superior. Usually also, abbeys are larger or more prominent institutions than the average monastery. And it is not always the case, but many abbeys, because they are ancient, are still installed in historical buildings. Returning to our history, we saw that monasticism had spread to Western Europe, played a role in Christianization, and with these evolutions, monasteries increasingly became economic units that had land to exploit and around which social life organized. In the wild and often dangerous context of the 7th or 8th centuries, this period has also been called the Dark Ages for a reason. Monasteries also became the only welfare institutions available, and for the poor or for travelers, there were little safe havens. And to these functions was increasingly added a role as places of learning and culture. The monks were, in average, more educated than the rest of the population. Literacy rates were very low at the time. And so, with the blessing of ecclesial and secular authorities, In many regions, monasteries became the places where books were kept, manually copied. Printing was not used yet and wouldn't be before centuries. And besides their spiritual life, monks had time for intellectual or artistic activities. It is no coincidence that if you look at lists of medieval historians, chroniclers, theologians, or even artisans and architects, you will find a lot of monks. This was very important in the preservation and transmission of antique works, from philosophy to literature to science. Manuscripts kept being copied and translated in monasteries. In this long period, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the end of the Middle Ages and the European Renaissance, more than a millennium, arguably a lot of the transmission work was done in Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Islamic world. But in all of Europe, monasteries kept the presence of a written culture, and they had the largest libraries before there were universities or significant private libraries. For educated people or for individuals drawn to writing, reading, and the sciences, entering a monastery was a logical path at the time. And even when large universities developed in Western Europe, in Bologna, in Paris, in Oxford, the web of monasteries was still way denser than the academic world that was slowly forming. And this blooming of monasticism in the Middle Ages has to do with all this. Monasteries taking in a bigger and bigger role in social life, as welfare institutions that gave food to the poor, as hospitals, as schools. This is where one would learn to read and write, as orphanages, as refuge for travelers that also worked as hostels, a function many monasteries still have as a source of income, as important centers of production of food, drinks, and crafts. In a sense, this answered to this centuries-old critique that we discussed before, the critique about the lack of implication of monasticism in social life. Medieval monasteries, beside their inner communal life and the importance of prayer and study inside, were very inserted into the economy and the society of their time. And this insertion and dynamic of monasticism found its full dimension with the expansion of the Cluny Abbey, often considered the leading institution of Western monasticism in the 11th and 12th centuries. By the early 10th century, the need for a return to a stricter observance of the rule of Saint Benedict was felt across the monastic world and in the Church. You remember, the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, had spread to close to the entire Western European monasticism and was now the default code of organization and conduct for monasteries, both male and female. By the early 10th century, there was this sensation that the rule was not respected anymore, not well enough. Cases of corruption, monks lacking discipline, So there was a willingness to return to a stricter observance of the rule, while at the same time embracing fully this insertion of monasteries in social life that I just described. And Cluny Abbey was the exemplification of this. It became extraordinarily successful at attracting new monks, new people, and often entire existing Benedictine monasteries that placed themselves under its lead. Instead of opening new monasteries that would have taken their independence, new monasteries founded by or in association with Cluny were designated as priories, and they remained directly accountable to the abbot of Cluny. This ended up creating a vast network of 1,400 dependencies, including about 200 major monasteries across France. The historical seat of Cluny was in Burgundy, and also Italy, England and Scotland, Spain, and as far east as Poland in the 12th century. At its height, Cluny had about 10,000 monks under its authority, and its abbots were very powerful figures. They advised kings, popes, and actually 4 different abbots of Cluny later became popes, including Urban II, the pope who first called to the Crusades to the Holy Land by the late 11th century. Cluny Abbey multiplied income sources. There were its vast domains, its economic activities, and also the copy of manuscripts richly decorated, which at the time was incredibly expensive. And on top of that, the abbey received enormous donations. Its approach to monastic life emphasized continuous prayer for the monks, and the rich and powerful of the time would make big donations to the abbey to be included in these prayers. These important revenues, the treasures Cluny received, were spent on extensive charitable work, a magnificent liturgy, and also spending on architecture. The abbey was founded in 910 at the beginning of the 10th century. And in the 10th century, the abbey only had a modest church. By the late 10th century, a larger church was commissioned to reflect the size and the growing success of the abbey that had begun to form its network of establishments. And by the late 11th century, the time of the First Crusade, the abbey built a third church, a marvel of Romanesque architecture. At the time, it was the largest church in Christendom until the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome in the 16th century, under the form we now know. This third Cluny church was 555 feet long, about 170 meters, and it was spectacular. With high ceilings, it had 5 naves, a rich decoration for the time, and it influenced the last decades of the Romanesque style that would soon be replaced with Gothic architecture. This church, the third one, was a testament to the power and wealth of the abbey, but it disappeared. It was dismantled for stones after the French Revolution. The order of Cluny lasted until the French Revolution too, but after its peak of the 12th century, it declined. Due to financial troubles as its income sources dried up, and due to the dislocation of its network of establishment, because of the appeal of other orders, we're going to speak about it, the rise of nationalism and wars too, for example between France and England. It became impossible for a French abbé to receive income from England in the context of the war between the two kingdoms. And various internal schisms happened too. But beyond its architecture, the most important legacy of Cluny is probably the way it disseminated knowledge, manuscripts, art across Europe, and uniformized the education of scholar monks between countries for decades, spreading the same references, the same aesthetic, the same approach to scholarly learning, from Italy to England or Spain to Poland. It was one of the institutions or phenomena that contributed to make Christian Europe a more uniformized, or at least connected, space in medieval times. Now the life of the average Cluniac monk was quite far from these grand plans and high politics the abbots participated in. The monks lived according to the rule of Saint Benedict, sharing their time between prayer, collective prayer with various services every day, and individual prayer, in between the gatherings that paced and still pace the daily existence of monks and nuns. And the rest of the time was dedicated to work, which included studying scriptures and meditating on them, and manual labor, seen not just as a necessity to feed the community, but as a healthy practice for the body and the mind, with a preference for labors that allow silent prayer, this continuous prayer that Cluny emphasized. Now, when I described the power, the assets, and the privileges that Cluny or other Benedictine abbeys accumulated at the time, especially this period of the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, you may have thought that this didn't necessarily bode well for them. And this is right. The extreme wealth of Cluny and its magnificence, even though it funded a lot of charitable work, it was hard to reconcile with the original function of monasticism, a supposed withdrawal from the world, a life of poverty and self-denial. What was the connection between this and an order that builds magnificent churches and becomes so influential? A bit like Cluny had been, for a part at the start, a reaction to the loosening of monastic rules. Another reaction was cooking, a willingness to return to the roots of monasticism and life principles taken from the gospel, the rejection of material wealth, and more generally a wish to return to the spiritual simplicity of earlier times. There were multiple reactions and new approaches to monastic life in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries that were triggered by this. As many attempts at reinventing monasticism or offering alternatives within it. I'm going to tell you about a few ones, some of the most famous. The Carthusians and Cistercians of the late 11th century, and 1 century later, the very important rise of the so-called mendicant orders that include three orders you may have heard of: the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and also, even though they are different, the Carmelites. The Carthusians and Cistercians were born from a will to return to stricter rules. The Carthusians, which were always a small order, are a particularly demanding or strict institution. They were founded by Saint Bruno of Cologne in the late 11th century, and they have their own rule. A Carthusian monastery, a charter house, is a community of hermits. Each monk or nun lives in a separate house with a little garden. These houses are all identical and enclosed inside the monastery. They live in solitude for extended times of prayer, studying, and rites performed alone. They are free to do what they want. No one watches them, but this is the heart of their lives. During the day, for a limited time, they also gather at fixed hours for religious services and for work. The Carthusians are known for making the Chartreuse liquor, which is originally green. There is also a yellow variety, but the green one is more famous and gave its name to the Chartreuse color. So they are part of a community to which they contribute by their work, and they gather for services, common prayers, but they barely speak to each other when they do, just the bare minimum, and the rest of the time they live in silence. That's the choice they made in their quest to search God or to be found by Him. That sounds like a very demanding vocation, but the Carthusian order always went on since its foundation, and still exists today, with 23 charter houses, 18 for men and 5 for women. The main one, the Grande Chartreuse, being in the French Alps. The Cistercians, who also still exist, were another reaction to the perceived loosening of the observance of Saint Benedict's rule and to the extreme wealth of Cluny. So their core principles emphasize austerity and isolation, with monasteries built in remote areas preferably. They intended to apply the rule of Saint Benedict more strictly, and they are called Cistercians because the order started with the foundation of the Abbey of Cîteaux in Burgundy, like Cluny, a little bit to the north. Cîteaux also had a large expansion, with its own network of monasteries. One thing it kept from Cluny was the centralized organization with daughter monasteries established under the supervision of the mother house. This theme of going back to a simpler and stricter observance of the rule, in that case Saint Benedict's rule, is recurrent in monasticism. In the 17th century, the Cistercians had their own schism for that very reason. Maybe you've heard of the Trappists. The Trappists are another order, also a Benedictine order, born from the will to implement a reform that would return once again to a stricter observance. So the Trappists splitted from the Cistercians in the 17th century. Far from the image of stagnation that is sometimes given to medieval times, when it came to religious debates and theology, the medieval period was really intense. And yet another reaction to wealth, worldly possessions, not only in monastic orders but also in the church and society in general, would be the rise of mendicant orders, new orders preaching radical poverty. These are diverse. The Franciscans, for example, named after Saint Francis of Assisi, and their equivalent for women, the Clarices or the Poor Clares. Saint Clare was a disciple of Saint Francis. So the Franciscans and Clarices give a lot of importance to their communal life. They have a discipline, but they spend time together and try to keep material things as simple as possible, also choosing to depend on others for their subsistence. They work, but they also need donations. They are a mendicant order, and they want it rather than material security, to experience this human bond, to be dependent from their neighbors who live outside in the world. With differences in doctrine and history, the Dominicans are another order with its own rules, and when these orders rose in the 13th century and started to recruit very successfully, often at the expense of the older Benedictine orders, this was rather revolutionary at the scale of the monastic world. The first time in centuries that the ancient rule of Saint Benedict was being challenged by new monastic codes. Now Saint Francis or Saint Dominic, the founders of these orders, knew very well the writings of Saint Benedict and did not reject them. A lot of their principles are similar, but they gave this older rule a new twist, a new spiritual angle. I told you the Franciscans and Clarices attached a lot of importance to fraternal life in their communities. A different approach to this is the Carmelites. The Carmel is yet another mendicant order founded in the 12th century. But it is known, and also still lives on today, as the order reformed by Teresa of Avila, a Spanish mystic and saint from the 16th century. She created the Reformed Carmelites, also called the Discalced Carmelites. And this other type of community allows more time in solitude for its members. A typical Carmel, of men or women, is a small community. Initially, Teresa of Avila wanted only 13 members. It can be a bit more, but it is often less than that nowadays, because recruitment is difficult. A Carmel is a community of hermits. They have services and prayers together. They eat together, and they have recreation times too. But the rest of the time, they favor silence and solitude for personal prayer and meditation. So they work alone in separate rooms. and more than other orders, a Carmel is very well separated from the rest of the world. All these orders I mentioned are cloistered. That is to say, they live in a separate space behind a physical wall, even in the heart of a city. The Carmelites historically met their rare visitors behind a gate that remained closed, even though these rules tend to be loosened nowadays. But strict separation from the rest of the world is not an absolute rule. The following centuries would be ones of decline for monasticism, with less vocations, a loss of influence, and generally a withdrawal from the very active position that medieval monasteries had acquired socially and economically. So a relative decline, but the reforms with the creation of new orders, new approaches to the rules, would never stop. I mentioned a few orders that appeared during the Middle Ages, in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, but there were others. We could also talk about the Augustinians, for example, and these new initiatives never stopped to our day, including the founding of communities that were no longer cloistered, but instead worked among the rest of the population, in hospitals, or that made the choice to form very small groups living in poor neighborhoods close to the population, and, like them, in small houses or apartments. As long as there are vows, including celibacy and chastity, a life in which prayer occupies a long time every day, this is monasticism. Despite this constant renewal, monasteries never returned to their medieval peak of the 12th century, and their numbers began to slowly decrease over several centuries. Struggles that would intensify with the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, because almost all monastic houses in France and neighboring countries like Belgium or Switzerland were closed by force at the time, and the buildings confiscated. France had long been a major center for monastic life and reforms, and by the early 19th century it had become almost a monastic desert. Before that, monasticism had suffered from the Reformation that had made it shrink in Northern Europe, and it had a presence in North America, but never with the density it once had had in Europe. There was a certain rebirth in the 19th century in Western Europe, due in large part to the reopening of monasteries, of ancient orders that had been closed during the French Revolution. This monastic rebirth was helped by a few new figureheads. For example, a Carmelite called Thérèse of Lisieux, who died young, but was made a saint, and has become widely read and venerated in modern times across Catholic communities. She is certainly the most popular of modern saints in the Catholic Church. But even though the movement of constant renewal, with the opening of new monasteries, and the existence of a few communities that are in good health and recruit, even though this never stopped, the reality of monasticism today, at least in Europe and North America, is that it keeps shrinking. More communities close than open, and the average age of their members keeps increasing. Maybe something will happen and change this trend, who knows? But still, monasteries are there, and tonight we barely scratch the surface of this continent that is almost invisible to all of us who don't belong to it. There could be much more to say about this topic, but we're going to end tonight's story now. I hope you liked it. You can now let go and fall asleep. Or, if you're not sleepy, pick another story from my library. I'll be back soon with a new story. In the meantime, sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.